This lesson will cover Chapter 10 on the media. Media includes tools that are used to store and deliver information or data. Some of the categories of media include print media, TV, radio, or new media. And when we talk about new media, we're talking about internet websites, social media like Instagram, YouTube, and other cellular technologies like applications. What new media has led to is the increase in what we call fake news stories. So these include the journalistic pieces that are put out by everyday average citizens. We're not talking about people with journalism degrees, and then also may not have checked their resources or just their sources in general when they put out information or they do a write-up, and they're not as inclined to exercise the kind of caution necessary to ensure that what they put out there is credible. There are several political functions of the media. The first is to provide information. So electronic media is the primary source for information for most people today. Information overload can happen, so that's just where people feel like they're constantly, able to access news, and that can make them feel like they're just in excess of all of this information that's coming at them from these news stories, and it causes users to often ignore certain events. Also, with the rise of infotainment, these are news shows that combine entertainment and news, and they often portray the news in a very satirical way. They're often very critical of what's going on in politics, and some examples would be Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update. We can also look to other programs like John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, or we can look to Hassan Minhaj's Patriot Act, or we can look to Trevor Noah's The Daily Show. The second purpose of media is to make informed decisions or help citizens make informed decisions. So the media helps people make informed decisions about policy. They also can begin the process with framing, so the way that they set up the context to a particular event or issue. Gender has also become a common frame that journalists provide context for. For example, Clinton's emphasis on being the first woman president. Another purpose the media holds is influencing public agenda. So the media can help shape the public agenda. When we talk about the public agenda, we're talking about public issues that are most demanded by the public to give attention to from the government. And some issues would include marriage equality. That generated a lot of media coverage. This can also lead to priming, which is bringing certain policies on issues to the public agenda through media coverage. Again, when we look at the bills that are running through Congress in each chamber of Congress, we know that it doesn't go in a particular order. It doesn't move through chronologically. Typically, the bills that are given most attention to that might move through faster would be the ones that the media is giving a lot of attention to and placing the pressure on government to address. The media also serves as an important forum for political conversation. Before, information flowed directly from the media to the people, but now people are allowed to be responsive, to also become a part of the conversation. So, historically we looked at the letter to the editor, which allowed for readers to respond to stories in the news, and sometimes those stories would get printed or those responses would get printed. Now the internet has really expanded the ability for anyone to share their views. So, blogs, discussion boards, comment sections, Facebook, Twitter, as much as, there may be a lot of inaccurate information out there, it still has also allowed for the people to be greater watchdogs, for them to also hold accountable different media outlets or different significant individuals or politicians in what they do. And if the media isn't giving it much attention, people might be able to forcibly bring that attention to the public's knowledge. Another purpose of media is to socialize children. And so when we think about how we have all been socialized from a young age, there are ways that our views of how politics should take course or how they should play out can very much be connected to what we've been exposed to growing up. So, media socializes new generations to political culture. TV shows like Sesame Street send messages about diversity. SpongeBob episodes like Bikini Bottom had its first presidential election between Patrick versus Larry. And then voting on shows like The Voice may reinforce democratic principles. So let's take a look at how the press and politics have evolved over time. Let's take in a historical view. Let's look at the early role of press. From the 1790s to 1830s, the press was primarily for leaders of political parties. The penny press allowed for newspapers to be sold for a penny, so more and more people had access to that information. Journalism also was an important ethical practice, and it was the practice of gathering and reporting events. The average American could read, so literacy rates started to increase, and also the reduced price allowed um, for more advertisements. So the advertisements allowed for that material to be at reduced price because, again, the marketing made it advantageous for people to seek out these advertisements and fund the production of this material. It also increased the circulation and profits as well. I think it's also fair to note that this idea of fake news isn't new. We can look to the idea of yellow journalism, which was an irresponsible sensationalist approach to news reporting. So when we see like newspapers start to compete with each other, they tried to garner the attention from people with these very sensationalized headlines. And so, this is where we see how the marketing and the competitions and getting people to pull out advertisements really shapes what kind of news stories are given attention to and how they're framed. Many people have argued that the primary reason that media reports in the way that it does is fueled by capitalism and the fact that many news outlets and sources are expected to continue to garner attention and support and viewers. And the best way to do that is to, again, report on specific things that get people emotionally stirred up and also to keep and hold their attention. This brings us to the concept of muckraking, which are criticisms and the exposing of corruption in government and industry by journalists. So this is a very important role that the media has played. And so we can see this in the novel The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, and in which we see the exposure of the meat processing industry. So this has been a great way that the media has held corporations and businesses accountable. It also led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the establishment of the Food and Drug Administration. So we can see how, the media acting as a watchdog and reporting on these stories can be very significant in creating more gains for the rights of consumers. We've seen that newspapers have also evolved and changed. Print newspapers have decreased and digital newspapers are now increasing. So some examples would include USA Today, the Huffington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic. But what they often do is they'll put out these digital paywalls. So, they'll often grab your attention with a very sensationalized story, something that's really used to garner your attention and get you to click. So we can kind of see this as clickbait, but then it's the practice of limiting the access to a website unless users pay a fee or purchase a subscription. So you won't be able to actually read the article unless you actually pay for that subscription. This brings us to the media go electronic, the radio and television revolutions. So the radio from the 1920s to the 1960s certainly evolved. Radio provided immediate media coverage and direct contact between people and the government, and FDR really realized the value of the radio. This led to fireside chats where FDR's radio addressed what could inform the public about, the New Deal, the bank crisis that was going on, World War II. So this was really seen as a direct way the president could report to and become more favorable to the public. So from the 1970s to the 1980s, we saw a rise in talk radio. And these were conversations and interviews about topics of interest, along with call-ins from listeners. And in 1987, the Fairness Doctrine happened to be repealed. So, Originally, the Fairness Doctrine required stations to present issues in an honest and fair manner. Listeners now, however, tend to listen to stations that align with their views and are more ideological. It's funny because a lot of people say that media tends to be more liberal, but it really just depends on type of media. Most of political radio and talk radio happens to be more conservative in comparison. All right, looking at television, TV had its effect in politics during the 1940s. Candidates now need to be telegenic or look good on TV. So we saw this really become very prominent between JFK winning over Nixon in a televised debate. JFK was seen as kind of younger, more handsome, seemed to be more relaxed. Nixon seemed to be more flustered. He was kind of sweating. He looked older. But when comparing radio to TV, Nixon won among radio listeners versus JFK, who won among TV viewers. In addition, today people are less likely to watch cable TV. News network viewership has decreased with age. So again, older people tend to watch those news networks versus younger people. Younger people, though, have started to shift. They are still, paying attention more so to the news, but they tend to get their news from media outlets on the internet. News channels like CNN and Fox do practice narrowcasting, and that's the practice of aiming media content at specific segments of the public according to political ideology or affiliation. And it's led for media segmentation, which is the breaking down of the media according to the specific audiences. So, for example, we not only see this in news networks with Fox News appealing more so to conservatives. CNN used to be more, the moderate, trusted news station, I guess you could say, or cable news network. Now it certainly has become much more liberal. But again, looking at other types of media that are more specific to certain types of audiences, we can look at BET or Black Entertainment Television, Telemundo, the Lifestyle Network, just to name a few. Many people have grown to be concerned for the emergence of certain networks and how it may be controlled in the hands of just a few. Some examples would include convergence and consolidation. Convergence has to do with the merging of various forms of media under one corporate roof and one set of business editorial leaders. So some examples would include Politico with Capital News Corporation rebranding as this and expanding to its coverage to Europe. With consolidation, that's the phenomenon of large corporations buying smaller ones so that there are fewer companies and products available. Apple with Siri, for example, Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. Again, just a couple of examples of how we see these conglomerates come into play, in turn increasing their influence. So with media evolving as well, we've now allowed for more watchdogs to come into the arena. Many would see this as a benefit as the rise of cable stations and internet brings news to people. But it does, however, put the government in greater scrutiny or at the risk of greater scrutiny, where the media might hang on every little thing and every little mistake can be amplified. It also can increase access to news, which brings full coverage, analysis, debate, and discussion. And so again, because there are so many different outlets that may serve many different purposes, it can mean that we have access to more. But we're also distracted by more because we have so many other entertainment options that don't have to do with politics. So that's the shortcoming. Blogs have become an important component of how individuals communicate and convey information from a subjective standpoint. So there is a break in the neutrality with blogs. You are getting very biased information or biased perspective. One of the greatest complaints about media is the ideological bias. Conservatives claim that the majority of news reporters happen to be liberal. Recently, there's been much attention to the role of conservative media in politics, and when surveyed, 63% of people believe that media is biased. This can also bring to a more specified category like corporate bias, and corporate bias is the desire to attract or please an audience. So critics argue that the media bias is actually the result of corporate structures that dominate the news industry. They skew what is covered so that they can please certain audiences, and these profits influence the media to cover what the viewers want. Political scandals, for example, sex scandals, celebrity heavy news, just to name a few.